Excellent, right, let's kick off then. So thank you for giving your time this afternoon to join this panel as guests. We are enthusiastic about talking to the students and those here today about the challenges, I suppose, of choosing a career that avoids greenwashing. And so my name is Belinda, and I'm really honoured to be joined by such a range of people who are going to talk a bit about their experiences of forging green careers, and we'll be taking questions from you, the audience, as well. Please do put your questions into the Q&A and they'll be kind of sent through to me, and I'll deal with them kind of as we go along as opposed to at the end. So as things occur, you pop them in and I'll try and get through the ones that we can manage. So firstly, I'm Belinda Bell. I'm a fellow in social innovation at the Judge Business School. My background is in social innovation and social entrepreneurship. And recently I've kind of transitioned into working in global systemic risk, thinking about the biggest pools of capital available to us, which are pension funds, and how we can redirect that capital to address the interlocking systemic risks that we face. And I've had a career of many parts, as I think have most people of my age. So it's very interesting to think about if one was to start at the beginning and how you might make your decisions. So I've got with me today Zach Coleman, who many of you will know, who's the Student Union President. I also have Doug Parr, who's the Chief Scientist and Policy Director at Greenpeace. Nick Villiers, who's from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership and is the Director of Sustainable Finance there. And Fran Warburton, who comes from Client Earth, an organisation I'm a particular fan of. And she's the Strategic Communications Officer there. So to kick off, what we'll do is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to tell us a bit about their current role and what they do day to day, what they love about it, and the impact that it has. And then to maybe explain their career journey so far. So shall we start then with Doug?
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Doug Parr. I am, as Belinda said, I am variously titled either Chief Scientist or Policy Director at Greenpeace, which doesn't actually tell you anything very much, because yeah, job titles often don't. Let me tell you roughly what I do, which is that with a background in science, I still do give technical advice to other people in the campaign section. I'm predominantly working with campaigns people, but also with media and with politics people, a lot with politics people, about making sure our arguments are as robust as they can be, as attuned as they can be, and as wise as they can be given the circumstances, to make sure that we are thought through but simultaneously radical. So I've been doing something like that for about a quarter of a century now, and which is longer than any normal human should possibly bear it, but I'm still there. And that was following a doctorate. I got a bit of postdoc, and then going into the environmental civil society sector as a junior campaigner. So maybe I'll stop there and give others a chance to speak.
Lovely, thanks ever so much, Doug. And it's interesting you mentioned campaigns and media, because Fran, you're in comms, and so perhaps you could go next and talk about your background and your story, and also a bit more about Client Earth as well, please.
Sure, yeah, so hi everyone, nice to be here. I'm Fran and I'm a communications officer at Client Earth. And for those who aren't familiar with Client Earth, we are an environmental law charity that uses the power of the law to help create that systemic change in order to tackle the climate crisis. And in my role, essentially, my main priority is to work closely with our legal teams to maximise the impact of our legal interventions and lawsuits, and also advocacy work using communications. So day to day, what does that mean? In its simplest form, it's kind of crafting and implementing strategies that make sure that the legal work of our lawyers reaches the right audiences, and also helping to shape the narratives that we launch the legal interventions into. Communication is obviously such a critical part of climate change and like all efforts to address the crisis that we face. So at the communications team, the part we play essentially is to ensure that the messages that we're trying to put across from our organisation land with the audiences that we're trying to reach. We brief journalists, we seed stories, and really help to bring the critical issues that our lawyers are working on into the mainstream and into media attention. I've only been in the role about a year and 3 months, so still quite new in a way, and my journey to this role wasn't so straightforward. So I studied as a journalist at university, and then went on to report for a publication, or a specialist publication covering financial regulation, and then moved into a communications agency working with more corporate clients before I eventually ended up at Client Earth. But I haven't looked back since taking that final step.
That's lovely. Thank you, Fran. Nick, will you tell us about your background?
Excellent. Hello, everyone. Yes, so I run the Centre for Sustainable Finance within CISL, which, if you don't know about CISL, we work with business leaders, with policymakers, with financial institutions, other organisations, to drive change towards a sustainable economy. And by that, we mean thinking about people, nature and climate. So decarbonising the economy, but we also think about protecting and restoring nature and creating resilient and inclusive societies. And we do that through a number of ways, through education, both open enrolment courses, but also devising bespoke engagements to really get in at board level and very senior executive levels to drive change from the top of an organisation down. We do research, we bring together different actors in the economy, and we've also been more recently working a lot with the SME community, the small and medium-sized enterprises, which is an area of sustainability as an industry that isn't getting widely focused on. And I think what we try and do is really work at to meet the unmet needs. There's a lot of activity, but there's also a lot of areas that aren't focused on. So in terms of working with the finance industry, what we're trying to do is drive change in financial practice, so that they actually price capital according to the true cost of doing business, that they think about the long-term rather than short-term financial decisions, and that they innovate new products to support sustainable business. So, because we really believe that the finance is a huge lever for change across the economy. Now, I don't think anyone believes that there are many financial institutions who are doing necessarily the right things most of the time, but if you can get them to make a change, it flows through the entire economy. So we do that. So, what I do day to day is help run the team. We're about 15 people, and we've been recently focusing on how do we get people in banks and investment companies to better communicate with their clients around the needs to decarbonise, and understand what transition pathways look like, and co-design solutions to support change in their businesses. And we've also been helping them understand what their impact is and their dependencies are on nature. So how the destruction of biodiversity and land degradation actually starts to impact them, not as a moral question, but as actually a financial and a business question. So trying to bring it from the abstract into their day-to-day world. Prior to joining CISL 2.5 years ago, I spent the best part of 20 years working in the finance industry. And I'm sure we'll get into reasons why we changed, but I think it was an increasing frustration that my personal passions and desire to see change in the world, I wasn't able to influence that in my then role. Whereas what I love about my current role is the ability to work with senior leaders across the finance industry, so banking, insurance, and asset management, and help them understand what society expects of them and what they need to do in order to deliver a true economy. So again, we will probably talk about some of the difficult conversations we have to have at some point, but that's who I am and what we do.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Nick. Yeah, we'll come back to you in a moment on that sort of journey. But first of all, let's introduce our final panelist, Zach. I think some of the participants will know what your current role is, but do you want to just talk a little about your role? And in fact, you know, decided to go into student politics. I suspect you had a long career in activism before that. I don't know.
Sure, yeah. So I definitely, before I decided to run for undergraduate president on the Students' Union, was very involved in climate justice politics at the university. There's a really vibrant activist community at Cambridge, which played a sort of critical role in the university deciding to divest from fossil fuels. I was the environment officer on my college student union at Jesus College, and I campaigned really hard for the college to commit to divestment and reaching net zero by 2030. And that was a really kind of consciousness raising and transformative experience for me, which made me realize that there was sort of accessing key political channels, whether that's on a college students union. I was also on the college's governing body as the elected student representative there, and having a vantage point as a student, as a member of a younger generation, potentially with a slightly different perspective, having a vantage point into those conversations around critical decisions relating to investment, relating to decarbonisation, was really, really amazing, and taught me that having access to some of those key decision makers means you can have a really strong influence if you're persistent and always polite and evidence-based and I guess a bit dogged sometimes. So I decided to run to be the undergraduate president on a kind of plethora of issues. But I think, although student unions don't necessarily scream green jobs in the ways that the other panelists, you know, might have sustainability or green in the title of their organizations, I think any job where you're representing people, but particularly young people, I think now basically necessitates having a strong focus on the climate crisis and mitigation. So I wanted to take forward some of the policies that I'd worked on in my college on the university level. So looking at holding the university to account on its current climate commitments, seeing if we can make them any bolder, any more ambitious, looking at across the whole suite of the university's operations through a climate justice lens. And so day to day, I guess one of the things I love about this particular job and why I would encourage participants to consider political advocacy work is that when you're elected on a mandate with a particular set of policies, you can retain a lot of autonomy in terms of what you actually prioritize and work on and fight for. And I've been able to have conversations with people who otherwise I would never have had access to in this role. And it's been really amazing to be taken seriously, be listened to, and I think already make some inroads on a few key areas that hopefully I'll be able to get into. But I think, I mean, it's clear we need political leadership at levels much, much, much higher than where I'm at on this issue. But I think getting young people to consider political advocacy jobs, whether on local councils, on students' unions, is going to be critical in terms of getting that tapestry of different change makers across society that we need to mitigate the climate crisis. So yeah, really happy to talk about that and excited for the conversation.
Thanks, Zach. That's lovely. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting journey from kind of activists into professionals, and when people kind of navigate that and the different hats you wear, perhaps on different days. Excellent. So participants, you've met our panel now. Please do, if you have particular questions that you want to direct to particular panelists, please pop them in the chat and they'll get pushed, or in the Q&A, sorry, and they'll get pushed through to me and we'll try and manage them as best we can. But first then, let me just come back to Nick. Excuse my cat, sorry, God, it's bloody home working, it's a nightmare. Nick, as you touched on it there, so my next question is really, the students here, I'm guessing, our participants are interested in green careers and they've started out in that way. I'm thinking perhaps you didn't start out thinking you were going to go into a green career. So I'm interested in kind of, you know, how you made the decisions and about the kind of choices that went along that brought you in the end into CISL.
Yeah, sure. So you're right. I mean, I read geography and politics many years ago, so I had a sort of long-standing sort of interest in the area. But I I'll be honest, I went into banking thinking I'd work there for probably 2 to 3 years and then finding something more meaningful and interesting to do, and found the world changing around me and found something more meaningful and interesting to do in a financial context. It doesn't quite sit within green, but after I've been working for a few years, the financial crisis occurred, and I was lucky enough to be part of a team who were advising the Treasury on how to try and sort out the financial system and support, I guess, the economy whilst driving change at the financial system, and then working with a lot of financial institutions on post-crisis regulation. And that felt important and impactful and almost impact-driven, which is an odd thing as a mainstream banker, because you don't often, I think, have that that sense. And it was after that process came to an end that I could see the world slightly missing the opportunity and returning to business as usual. That I grew increasingly frustrated over a few years and actually just took a career break. So I stepped back, I left my job and spent a lot of time. I'd been increasingly focused on, I like to cook and I like to garden, and the two come together in thinking about regenerative agriculture. And I started really thinking about this extraordinary situation we have where the food systems should be a massive nature positive and carbon sink, and yet they're one of the highest emitting sectors we have, and modern farming methods often lead to destruction of biodiversity. And that sort of, I don't know, had been sitting with me for a few years. And but I took some time out, looked around, thought, what did I want to do? Spoke to lots of people who said, come and join us and issue green bonds at my bank. That's impactful. And my view was it wasn't fundamental enough. I mean, they are helpful and perhaps necessary instruments, but it wasn't going to drive the sort of scale of change that I thought was needed and at the pace needed. And the opportunity came up. I'm honest, I was approached by a recruiter looking to hire someone into CISL. I hadn't necessarily thought I would end up working at a university, but to find this part of a university that was, I guess, mission-driven, impact-led, but was trying to drive change across the mainstream economy, which is, sometimes a thankless task, but I think a necessary one. It just resonated, so I leapt at the opportunity and have been enjoying myself for 2.5 years there.
Thank you. And it is an interesting part of the university because so much of it is outward looking and trying to influence change in the real economy and in the real world. Yeah. Whereas Doug, you mentioned that you did spend a little time as a postdoc. Were you ever going to stay in academia? I mean, a quarter of a century ago, I don't know if you can remember, maybe you can remember your thinking processes. My
memory's not that bad. I mean, yeah, there was a period actually when I thought doctorate, postdoctorate, the academic life is going to be the one that consumes me. I'd go off to get a junior fellowship in the States. That was how it was mapped out. And it was when I was having a conversation with a friend who pointed out that when I was talking about my academic work, I was sounding a bit dull and lifeless. And when I was talking about the voluntary stuff that I was doing locally around Oxford, that I was sounding quite lively and quite interested. And she said, why is it like that? Why are you so dull about your future career and you're so excited about stuff that you're doing in your spare time? I mean, I know everybody can be a bit like that, but it's particularly acute with you. And so yeah, I thought, well, that's true, isn't it? I mean, the stuff I was already doing with the doctorate was on the ozone layer and the damage to the ozone layer, which of course was a huge issue in the late 80s, very contentious one. So already climate change was beginning to emerge on the horizon as something that would potentially be quite a big deal in future, even though those who were taking it seriously at that time were still sort of pretty niche, frankly. But one of those moments came up rather late in the day. I found out that there was an actual job going at Friends of the Earth, which was kind of relevant to where I was in the postdoc work on on ozone layer campaigning, and I just thought, well, okay, I'll give it a go, and just snuck in under the application deadline. Of course, remember there was no internet then; that was still to come. You had to get it in the post and do it recorded delivery and that kind of thing. Yeah, and then I got the job and never looked back. And I think you know, that's something like 30 years ago now. So why am I still here in what is by any accounts quite a draining occupation, particularly at moments like this when you're trying to influence UK energy policy in the Ukraine war, which has been, you know, hard work this last few weeks. And the answer has got to be twofold. One is that there are two things you've got to get out of a job if you're wanting to avoid greenwashing. One is you've got to feel like you're on the side of the angels, if you like, that you can look at yourself in the mirror metaphorically and say, yeah, I'm glad to be doing that. I think what I'm doing is right. And the other thing is you've got to enjoy, at some level, you've got to enjoy the day to day, even if it's really hard work sometimes, and even if it's really frustrating sometimes, that it's still a good thing to be doing. And whilst there have, of course, during any kind of tenure and any kind of organization for any length of time, the frustrations build up at times with either the internal nonsense, of which there is an endless supply, seemingly, of renewable resource. There is there are frustrations about not going very fast, but what you can at least draw on is that the day-to-day stuff can still be enjoyable, whether it's working with colleagues or whether it's the things you have to do and are doing. And fortunately, that's always been the case. At some level, I could always enjoy it. So whether it's advising new interns about what the state of play is, to talking amongst colleagues about the state of the political system, to doing media or being a witness for MPs. I mean, all of that stuff has happened within the last 10 days for me. And so it keep that kind of that kind of parallel track of being both valuable and also interesting on a day-to-day basis is something that can allow you to keep going. And I'm not naive enough to think that all jobs are necessarily going to have both. There can be jobs that I'm sure are creating planetary destruction on a day-to-day basis are deeply interesting, and just is like that, and vice versa. You can have so you've got to find things that match up for you in both ways.
And so after you moved to Friends of the Earth, your career has been all in the civil society voluntary sector since then. You must have lots of contacts with government and politics.
Oh yeah.
You've never thought of moving over into the public sector? That's not something that, it kind of feels like some people might have done that.
No, I mean, on a few occasions, I know people in the political domain, and indeed have gone off to work for the London Mayor and so on.
Yeah.
One of the things I think about two things around that. One is that one person who I knew quite well, who'd gone to work for the shadow cabinet, said he actually felt he'd had more influence when he was working at Greenpeace, which was kind of an insight. More influence over British policy.
Interesting. And
I'm not saying that's always going to be true. It's not going to be true in all circumstances, and it's not going to be true in all briefs. But that was his experience. And the other thing is, I suspect the project delivery for someone like the London Mayor or local government association or wherever it happens to be, isn't necessarily going to be my skill set. Others I know have moved over there. They've loved it. They've really liked it. When I hear accounts of what they're doing, I think, no, I'm happy where I am. Thank you. I'd rather be here. So, yeah, that's where I am.
You found your place, and I'd say we didn't introduce an academic on this panel because I figured that we have experience of what academia is. The students have probably got a sense of what that looks like, so we want to bring in these other voices. So Fran, would you talk to us a little bit about how you made your decision? Because you did explain to me that you became pretty miserable in when you weren't doing this type of work.
Miserable is one way to put it. Yeah, so I didn't start off or always consider of having a green career necessarily. I studied journalism because I wanted to tell people stories, and was just interested in people, and the path I ended up taking was very different to what I imagined. And I think that's fine. I think you're not necessarily going to get your dream job straight away. You might have to go through a few before you find it, or even that you just get yourself on the direction that you think, yes, this is for me, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm good at. And that was definitely the case for me. So once I'd moved over to the communications agency side, doing PR for businesses, and especially with everything that was going on in the world, I definitely had a bit of a crisis moment where I just thought, what is all this for? What does it matter? And I think that's when it really hit me. I was like, I'd be so much better at my job if it was being applied to something that I actually believed in. I'd be so much better at communications if I actually believed in what I was communicating about. And that's really what drove me to make the jump from the private sector to the third sector. And it's actually been funny to see how quickly I've developed professionally in the last year and a few months, because I care so much about what I'm doing in comparison to the years I'd spent previously, in the corporate world, where I didn't really feel like I connected with what it is that I was, that I was spending my time on every single day.
That's lovely, thank you, Fran. And Zach, do you want to tell us what you think you're going to do next? I didn't ask you if I should ask that.
Sure, yeah. So I've been thinking about it a lot because my term is coming to a close relatively soon. And yeah, I guess this kind of touches on a lot of the things that I wanted to talk about in this session, because I'm really thinking about where the greatest level of impact is. Is it within sustainability teams within much broader organizations, or is it within smaller organizations which are springing up all the time? I'm thinking organizations like Green New Deal Rising, there's organizations like Global Justice Now, which are very small emergent organizations, Stop Cambo, which have made huge splashes because of the agility that they're afforded by not being tied to kind of huge organizational processes and responsibilities. So I think my skill set is probably more in the area of campaigning and campaign communication. So I'm looking at those smaller organizations because I think that's where I'm really interested at the moment in seeing how they've been able to grab attention on key issues, and by focusing often in a fairly narrow way on one particular issue, like for instance the Cambo oil field, they've seemed to have been able to create change and make a splash in ways that sometimes larger organizations have struggled to. But then of course larger organizations also have far greater resources, institutional memory, capacity, contacts with key change makers. So I think we need all of them. I think just for me personally, what I'm interested in the moment is seeing if I can be part of some of those new emergent organizations. So that's where my head is now, but gosh, God knows where I'll actually end up.
Yeah, I'm sorry to jump that on you without sort of saying I would like you to. Okay, so I've seen there's a couple of questions in the chat about sort of specific questions about skills and stuff, and we'll come back to those, and we'll pop those in. But it seems from what Zach just said that maybe we should like dig into those sorts of issues a bit more. I mean, the environmental challenges that the planet faces are really very serious and very urgent, and we need change in all of these sectors. I liked your use of the word patchwork earlier, Zach, for like the change makers we need in all the different places. So some people think that it's important that well-meaning people like us work directly with big business, including directly in fossil fuel industry organizations, to address change from the inside. So clearly that's a controversial position, and I thought I'd take the opportunity to ask the panel's views on that, and if you think there are grey areas and ideas on how one might navigate them. And I know there's no black and white answers here. So yeah, I mean, Doug, would you like to start there?
Sure. I mean, yes, of course, there are grey areas. I think it's possible to demarcate some areas which are less grey, though. So if you think you're going to change a big oil company from the inside, good luck with that, because if you're coming in at a junior level, you're not going to, period. It's just not going to happen. If you want to affect change, so you could either adopt the kind of mole strategy, which is that you seek your way up and eventually become the CEO and then change it from the top, but you might have to wait 20 years or more for that. Dubious about that. If you want to have change and impact more immediately, then it means almost certainly joining somewhere where you can have influence, and therefore means joining somewhere smaller. Or it may mean joining an organization which is not like, look, I'm immensely privileged to work in a civil society organization which is funded by individual donations, right? I mean, you know, there are a lot of, the vast majority of people are going to have to make some kind of reconcile what they, you know, where they can make a crust with the sort of impact that they want to find. And as your question alludes, that's one of those tricky areas. I would say smaller organizations where you can have influence from the start is going to be more likely. Equally, if you're determined to go into the civil society space, which is where I might claim to have some knowledge and understanding, then often you need, you know, you do need a little bit of experience in some of the key disciplines, whether it's media, social media, political lobbying, etc. And in fact, we've just run a recruitment process for which I was on the panel on for political operatives. And yeah, they pretty much all had some background. All the interviewees had some background in some level of experience in political lobbying. So, but that was often in other parts of the civil society sector. So, you know, whether it's development charities, homeless charities, fuel poverty in one case, then they can, you know, sort of come through that. But to your point, if you move into the corporate sector, there are going to be grey areas. Period. Yeah, and I understand that. And you have to work it through in your own mind. I can give you some other guidelines, but I mean, probably best speak to others first.
Okay. Nick, you spend your time working with some of the kind of big, bad and ugly companies, and I'm sure the individuals within them are largely very lovely people, or some of them are. What's your kind of take on this?
Yeah. I think that's fair. You know, the people we work with are passionate about driving change, but I think Doug does raise an interesting point about the level of influence one has in at different stages in your career as well. So I think, you know, I do believe that we need well-meaning people who want to do the right thing in these organizations, because culturally they change. The voice of one individual, particularly unless you're CEO, is going to be limited, but it can create a groundswell of changes, and people are making day-to-day decisions on, you know, business decisions on a day-to-day basis. And if you've got someone who I guess has a strong moral compass or thinks about the impact of those decisions, I'd rather have that someone in there doing that, thinking about that and making that decision, than someone who is not. So I mean, I think there is definitely a role for it, but I do think that one has to recognize the level of one's influence in an organization, and but not be afraid to use your voice to drive change, because actually what we're finding is there are various stakeholders that are putting pressure on organizations, and I think there's, you know, I think there's a hugely important role for campaigning and advocacy work for pressure groups, for people to be exposing wrongdoings of large institutions and organisations. I think it's critical, but I don't think it's sufficient to drive change in the organisations. Driving change in the organisations also requires people within them to be equipped to understand what solutions look like and to make the right choices. So we need people within those organisations who are open-minded to what those pressures are and to try and drive the right choices.
Yes. I mean, Fran, you're lucky to in your work, as we've discussed it at Client Earth, is essentially non-controversial from a green perspective.
Well, I guess you could call suing governments and big companies quite controversial.
We're on the side of the angels here,
right? But yeah, I think the point about you might not be able to change much in one of like as a singular, but collectively, the more and more like-minded people that are entering these, these big organizations that typically harming the environment, and particularly in the carbon intensive sectors, then that collective becomes a lot more powerful than the individual. And more companies do care about what their employees think. That is the point of greenwashing, essentially. They're greenwashing to consumers, but equally they're greenwashing to prospective employees. They care about the image that they're presenting. So I think that although the comments of from Doug and Nick are completely right, I think it's still possible to make a change from within the company, if there is enough kind of weight and volume behind it.
Okay, thank you. And now we're sort of touching on the greenwashing thing. Let's kind of dive in a bit deeper on that. So I guess my question is, how should the students or job seekers that we have with us, how should they spot greenwashing? What can they look out for? What are the kind of the shorthands? And then we have some questions that sort of relate to, is a certain job actually effectively greenwashing? Is it meaningful or not? But in a general sense, Zach, I'm reckoning that you've done quite a lot of looking at this. What would you be looking out for spotting greenwashing?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was going to mention about the oil and gas companies is I think it's really interesting. We're in a sort of moment historically where applying for a job with green in the title can actually have the reverse effect if that green department within the organization represents less than 1% of its overall capital budget, and is actually used to effectively be a kind of PR arm to mitigate the impact of increasing scrutiny. So if you look at a bank like JP Morgan, I have no doubt that it has a glossy section on its website devoted to sustainable investment, but we also have to look more broadly at the fact that JP Morgan is the world's top funder of fossil fuels. And I think being very skeptical of a job, even if it's within a sustainability team, particularly if it's within a huge organization. And I think asking yourself questions like, when I enter this job, will I have links to the power brokers on the kind of core elements of the business model, or will I be siloed away in a sustainability department that does kind of tinkering around the edges and relatively cosmetic sorts of pieces of work in comparison to the overall bulk of the business? I think that's a really critical question. And asking yourself, I think we've kind of discussed the nuances of influence from within versus without, but actually for the organization that you're hoping to influence, looking at the history of what has worked for that organization, because I think sometimes we're inclined to think that it's always better to influence from within, but we've seen with the divestment movement, for instance, a very clear consensus emerging that actually pulling investments and disengagement until certain criteria are met can also be incredibly powerful. So is it better to, we're hearing from the oil and gas industry all the time that they're actually now nervous about recruitment pipelines from the top talent because people are alive to the fact that they're completely, they've got blood on their hands and they're not doing enough. So actually withholding our skills from these organizations rather than rushing into what they present as green jobs can be a much more powerful act particularly if, like I say, you identify that it's a department that's pretty disconnected from the major organs of power within that organization. And you know, for instance, a journalistic job might not have green in the title, but actually outlets like The Guardian and various others are doing incredible work exposing companies greenwashing, and there are, like I said before, a whole patchwork of different industries which may not have green in the title, but which may allow you a greater influence over a company than actually being within that company in a kind of cosmetic role. So those are some of my considerations that I'm looking at. And I would say try and look for external sources, type in the company's name in Google with the word greenwashing. Don't just rely on its own promotion. Look at its overall capital budget versus how much it dedicates to green initiatives. And the final thing I would say is have a basic understanding of what the climate science demands from business. So understand the kind of core top line IPCC recommendations about eliminating emissions by 2050, getting to 50% reduction by 2030, and be absolutely clear-eyed about whether or not that company is committed to those timelines, because things like we have invested 15 million pounds in X sustainable projects will sound like a lot, but actually it can be, it's a lot of fluffy language to avoid the fact that they are not compliant with these what ultimately are immovable and kind of maximum targets. We really shouldn't. 1.5 is dangerous enough. So I would say trying to have as independent and rigorous a critical process for interrogating each role. It takes more time, but it is really going to be really crucial to ensure you're not part of the problem unintentionally.
There's some top tips there, and they actually just do the homework of understanding what the IPCC is saying. It's really, really great advice. And also like the idea of almost avoiding something that has green in the title. Yeah, I can see that, right? I mean, with the exception of course of Greenpeace, which we do trust, but you can sort of picture that now that that's clearly being used. You just don't really want to trust it. Interesting. Doug, have you got top tips? You must see all sorts of greenwashing in the work you do.
I'll plus one to a lot of what Zach said there. I think, look, we're not people who are doing league tables of corporate performance and who we think's good and who we think's bad. But if one were to start about looking at a particular corporation with whom you might be interested in working, my first question about whether they are at least climate compliant. Climate is not the totality of environment, of course, but at least it is more measurable anyway. Is do they have a plan to be Paris aligned? Do they have if they do, what does it look like? Because if it depends heavily on offsetting, it's not really Paris aligned. It's just pretending to be. What is the core business? Could the core business survive in a 1.5 compliant world? So, lots of intensive agriculture. And again, as Zach pointed out, they might have green policy officers and whatnot, but there's no way you can have an intensive farming business, intensive livestock business with that's 1.5 compliant, it seems to me, or any more than one can have one that's based on fossil fuels. So the plans are often rated by an organization called Science-Based Targets Initiative. It's the biggest voluntary kind of assessment of excuse me of corporate plans that's around, and that would be one of those that I would look for. Not every sector has got that, so for those sectors that don't, I guess unfortunately a bit more homework. The other thing I would say is, we're on this topic of green is very much, where does this green bit fit in the organization? Because if it's part of the public affairs department, it's a no-no. But because green is being used as a way of managing public affairs, it's not being used as a core business attribute or as a recipe for how the business is transforming. It's got to be about the core business, because we're way past the moment, if we ever had a moment, when it can be seen as that aspect of business practice.
Thanks, Doug. So we've been talking here about, you know, the greenwashing in organisations. Some of the questions we've got are sort of about specific roles. And Nick, if I think if I could just pose this question to you, and please do also answer on greenwashing in general. But somebody's asking, and sorry, I don't have their name in front of me. Do the panelists think that working as a climate risk analyst for a large auditing corporate company is meaningful? So research on financial risks and climate change, the risks that are passed on to other organisations, or is it more like your green bonds analogy that somebody needs to do it? But so, what do you think about climate risk analysis? I'm hoping you can answer that.
Yes, and I mean, I don't have too much to add to the excellent advice that Zach and Doug gave on the greenwashing, because I think, you know, but it just occurs to me that probably doesn't need pointing out, but I'll do it anyway, that, you know, corporations and large financial institutions have just fantastic PR and communications team who are very slick at putting across the message they want people to understand, and therefore looking at the facts and looking for independent verification, I think is critical in assessing that. I mean, I would say, you know, I also completely agree where a team sits is key. You know, in the finance world, we've seen over the last few years, and this is in no small part down to the campaigning and advocacy work that people have been putting in. We've seen the sustainability teams move from either the communications team or the corporate and social responsibility area pretty much to working for the CEO, because they recognize that they're going to have to transform their business. Now, I think there are still some organizations that are very serious about taking on a transition and supporting it, and I think there are some who are not nodding to it and aren't so serious. But I think that the challenge of assessing whether someone is Paris aligned, for at least with a finance industry lens on, it is such that we've had over the last year 450 financial institutions pledge to reach net zero by 2050. And that's $130 trillion of assets. So that's, you know, it's clearly a positive development, but they've only pledged to do it, and they don't yet have tangible plans that you can actually measure and show and judge them against. Now, I think they recognise they need to do that, but it's going to take time, and that, I guess, leads to the question about the roles. Because a lot of the work that needs to be done in something like the finance industry isn't about grand gestures necessarily. It's about meticulous sort of analysis and understanding of what the transition pathways look like for different industries, and then being able to, I guess, map corporate activity against those activities and whether you should or should not be engaging with that company going forward. It's not, you know, so I think it can be a meaningful role, but it's a meaningful role in that it contributes to a larger whole. You're not necessarily going to be changing the world by yourself in that, but you need to have the risks being assessed, but you also need to have people who are developing new products to support things. You need the person in the financial institution who's dealing with the large corporate or the small corporate to be able to have a meaningful conversation and challenge them and understand where they are in that transition pathway that's being mapped out, in order to work out whether you should be investing in, you know, or supporting a new development in technology. And, you know, and you know, it's easy to think that companies don't change, and many of them don't, but there are examples of pivots such as, you know, Danish oil and natural gas, which transformed from an oil and natural gas company into Ørsted, you know, the world's biggest offshore wind. Now, that, you know, everyone needs to work out who are those who are actually going to do that, and then who are the others who are going to sit there and put out a nice report with lots of green pictures and flowers and children playing in meadows, and yet actually still stick to the core knitting of extracting fossil fuels from the ground and selling them. And I think, you know, I think Doug and Zach gave great advice as to how one can look beyond those glossy reports. But
thank you, Nick. Fran, I think that comms is getting like a bad rap here, unfairly. I mean, it sort of depends if we're like on the side of the angels, which of course, as I mentioned earlier, Fran is. So that's good. Doug, we've had a series of questions that you're best placed to answer clearly, which are about students who might want to become political campaigners and people without science degrees. Can they do policy advocacy? Do they need to have the science like you've got? Is it important that people go on and do master's or PhD level if they want to do political advocacy? Can you give us a kind of update on, I guess, how competitive that sort of world is, political advocacy for green things currently, and how best to get into it?
Okay, well, to answer the last question first, yes, it is quite competitive, which is why Greenpeace has tried to start running an intern scheme, because it's like, you know, everybody we were recruiting had already got several years of kind of civil society experience. Like, where's the starting point? However, I mean, to some of the other points, I think we did three appointments at various length of contract, and I think at least one of them didn't actually have a degree at all, because we felt the skills and capabilities were enough.
Elaborate what those skills and capabilities, what had this person been doing?
Yes, so what they'd got was they'd kind of worked up from a junior level and taken on more and more advocacy within the political space. That had accompanied, you know, building relationships with MPs. It had been organising events. So steadily working out from there to being able to think through what are the strategies for this particular project, what is the overall game plan for my organisation. So they've moved through that, and now, you know, bless them, they want to come and work for Greenpeace. That said, a lot of the people that we recruit for either political or campaign purposes or our comms purposes, they often do have degrees, if I'm honest, and that's not because it's a requirement of the job, but you know, communications is a core aspect of what we're doing, not even for those in communications roles. And you know, the experience of doing a degree does tend to enhance those capabilities, I think. In terms of the actual disciplines involved, actually science is rarely the background of the people that Greenpeace recruits across the board. Sometimes I wish it were not so, but it rarely is. And actually, I can't even remember the backgrounds of the three we recruited, or the two that had degrees anyway. But I'm pretty sure they were humanities and arts, not sciences. And I think my experience of it, when I did end up doing a lot more recruitment, was the same. We did occasionally get scientists coming through, but the majority was pretty eclectic in terms of the, you know, from history, geography, English, right across the board. And it was actually the skills and capabilities rather than the knowledge that was more interesting to us. So yeah, not having a science degree is no kind of bar to working, at least in my experience of recruitment at Greenpeace. I mean, I don't want to speak for every organisation across the environment sector at this point, but that's my experience. I don't know whether Fran has got anything to add to that, actually.
Fran, thoughts?
Well, at Client Earth, we're mostly lawyers. So there's, a lot of, or I think about 60% will be qualified lawyers who've moved from private practice into the organisation. But across the board, so in the comms team, I think experience is key, really. Although there's some like incredibly, you know, like most people may have a degree, may have done a master's, but I think what got me into the role and also what got others into the role is just the experience that we've built over the years in communications. So yeah, I think I tend to agree with Doug on that point, that it's the practical skills that can help along a lot.
So Doug, is it the case that you don't recruit lots of people with doctorates at Greenpeace? No, that's not what's going on there.
No, I mean, so there was a famous 80s campaigner in the environment space called Andy Bond, who said you only need 3 facts to campaign, because it's about political change, and you've got to round up politics. I think it's fair to say the world is not as simple as the 1980s when it comes to either politics or environmental policy, and that mantra doesn't quite hold. Nonetheless, it's astonishing. I always feel deeply saddened, actually, by how little people seem to know to be getting a voice in the environmental space. I mean, look at fracking, for God's sake, and the enthusiasm for that again. Clearly, people know absolutely nothing and are still prepared to raise their voice in the public domain. Obviously, part of my job is marshalling the facts and actually, advising others within the organisation. These are the critical things that you need to know, and now we need to marshal them into a form that's really communicable, accessible, and got political charge. But the learning, uptake, and ability to communicate does not sit within a scientific discipline. I mean, there are skills here that do matter. You've got to have respect for evidence. That's not just about science, though. That could come from a whole range of disciplines. But in fact, I would hope most undergraduate degrees would give you that. A respect for evidence, a respect for content, a respect for factual matter, and kind of staying within those bounds. But yeah, it's not science specifically.
Okay. That's very interesting. Nick, I don't know about your colleagues at CISL. Some of those are academics and many of them have transitioned from the private sector. Would that be right? How are they differently able to influence the corporates that you work with?
I think that's right. We come from a wide variety of backgrounds. Many have worked, look, plenty of people have worked at CISL. We've been going for 32 years, and I have plenty of colleagues who've worked there for sort of 15, 20 years as well. So they've sort of grown up through the organisation. In my team, a lot of the team have worked in finance at some point, which gives us, I guess, insights as to how things work and where the blockers are and what the challenges are that need to be met. But by no means all. And you're right, we have people with academic backgrounds. So we have academics who come and sit with us. We have plenty of people. I think on my team of 15 people, we have 3 or 4 with PhDs and a couple more with masters on there. But many of us have simple bachelor degrees. I think 1 or 2 don't have degrees at all because they've come in as a sort of administrative support level to support the team, and then can grow through that a little bit like Doug, showing that you're adding to your career and demonstrating. So I don't think it's necessarily prerequisite for engaging to even have a degree, but I think we certainly value a huge variety of backgrounds because I think diversity of thought is important, but I think also coming back to that evidence-based and that respect for evidence, I think that's key, and that's where the rigor comes through from the academic side. I think sometimes to ensure that the solutions and the approaches are they're Cambridge University standard outputs. These are high quality outputs, but also need to be translated. We spend a lot of our time translating research from academia into things that practitioners can use. So having that mindset of being able to deal with both is pretty key.
I must say, I find these responses from my own perspective really heartening because, of course, if we sitting here within a university, so many people have doctorates who are working in all sorts of roles that are far below their academic capabilities. But here, it's just it's 2 a penny, and it's just from a diversity of thought perspective. It's really important that we have roots into these roles from all people from all sorts of different backgrounds. So it's heartening to know that goes on in both of your setups. There's kind of one follow-up question here, if you could take this, Doug. So if most people you take on are not scientists, what is the best strategy for a scientist who wants to get somewhere like Greenpeace, to get involved somewhere like Greenpeace? You know, you do have some science-based roles, but would you ever want a doctorate level, or would something less than that be sufficient?
Yeah, I mean, yes, of course. I don't think we'd ever put it in the person spec, though. I think, well, until I leave, which, you know, could happen anytime really, but so I'd come back to, you know, we certainly wouldn't not want those skills. And I think that what we find is that, I mean, for a civil society organization, we're pretty big, but it's still the case that the specialist teams within them are relatively small. So I am pretty much on my own. I mean, so the chief scientist thing is a bit misleading. It sounds like I've got hordes of minions running around doing my bidding, and in fact, it's only me. But I work quite closely with particularly the political team, but also, as I said, media and so on. And so those individual teams are quite small, and then, you know, it's really important what individuals can bring to that team from their outside experience. So it's not just about, you know, what's in the person spec. We add to that team by the individual experiences and attributes and qualities and thinking, and that the individual can, and perspectives, and even sometimes their political views of what people can bring in. And I would say on that basis that somebody bringing a doctorate in whatever form, whether it's on medieval history or you know, some aspect of particle physics, is going to bring something that is fresh and different compared to the people who are already there. And but, you know, that's never going to be the core aspect of the discipline. If we're just thinking about the political team for a moment, their core discipline is to be able to take the arguments, marshal them, project them into the political domain, and try and build relationships with MPs, their staff, special advisors, ideally with ministers. That's really difficult. Relevant civil servants, and try and get those arguments in there. And a bit of experience really helps, but the individual attributes of the individual people will help too.
Thanks, Doug. And on the subject of medieval languages, I could just cycle back to an earlier question that came in earlier for Nick. We have a modern medieval languages graduate who has some public affairs and campaigning and wants to work in the sustainable finance sector, but doesn't have a finance background. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the sustainable finance sector, what that term might mean, and if there are routes in for people who aren't finance people.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, look, the sustainable finance sector is a broad thing. I mean, there are financial institutions that are impact driven, like impact investing, where the whole rationale of everything they're trying to do is make a positive change in the world rather than and make a financial return. Or you get a bank like Triodos, where you know, they are very impact led, but majority of financial institutions aren't, you know, in the way that we would understand it sitting around this virtual table today. But there are jobs within them that are sustainable finance jobs, and that could be, you know, as I said, setting sustainable finance strategy. It could be doing some of the modeling and some of the thing. It could be working in renewable energy. But I think that is a small part of the sector. I mean, it's probably where the rubber hits the road, in that's what you're trying to influence, what we spend our time trying to influence. The other sector is there are a few academic or centres like us within universities who are trying to drive new knowledge and new practice. So there's us, there's Oxford, LSE, Imperial. There are a lot of organisations that focus on measurement and trying to model and understand what future pathways look like. Some of those are genuine, some of them are I don't know whether Doug would agree that SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, is a sustainable finance thing, but they are a core part of the sustainable finance world. They do much more beyond that. But they but then there are also many other organizations out there that are effectively data providers that are dressing themselves up as sustainability, or they're selling sustainable data. I personally have some skepticism about some of those organizations, because I think actually making data freely available will drive change at a wider and quicker pace than having it controlled by people who are using it for profit. But and then there are campaigning organizations as well. You know, we talked about some of them earlier when thinking about where to look, but there's people like BankTrack and others who follow the activities that banks are undertaking and hold a mirror up to them. So there's a whole wide range, from the campaigning to the working within finance, you know, and then there's, you know, all the consultants and everyone who are trying to at best make a contribution, or certainly at least make a profit out of the sustainability, the sustainable finance journey that we're going on. So there's certainly plenty, because of the plethora of activities in the world of sustainable finance. There's certainly plenty of activities of those with a variety of backgrounds to get involved. I don't think, you know, it might be in communications or campaigning, or it might be, I mean, look at me, I didn't have a finance background when I went to work at a financial institution, and I read geography and politics, and there are many of my peers who joined, and you continue to recruit people with different backgrounds because you want that variety of thought. So I think it depends slightly on what angle the person's interested in, but I would certainly feel that there are opportunities, and they should think about the skills that they can bring rather than the background, the sort of the credentials that they have.
Yes, Nick, I'd back that up. Previously, I was the founder and chief executive of a small social finance organisation. I mean, small, but we kind of, you know, lent £1 million a year to vulnerable people. And people who weren't able to access mainstream finance. And I set this thing up and ran it and all the rest of it and raised investment. And my first degree is in social anthropology. So, you know, I can add up for sure. But I think there's quite a lot of mystification around finance, and particularly, you know, innovative financial products, that kind of stuff, you know, makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. You know, it's mainly adding up and taking away and dividing by 12 and things like that, you know. Yeah. So I find
it's very good at jargon to make people who work in it feel smarter, perhaps, than.
Don't buy that. Thanks, Nick. Okay, so I think we've cycled through some of the questions in the chat. If you do have more questions or follow-ons, please pop them in there. But I wanted to ask the panelists a bit about their kind of personal experience of living this life and trying to lead these sorts of careers. From your perspective so far, people, can you talk a bit about like how you've maintained your drive and motivation over the years? You know, some of you are earlier or later in your careers, when the work we are all doing is so important. It feels like burnout and the inevitable frustrations of the slow progress. It just feels like there's a huge risk here to people's mental health. And so, can you talk a bit about how you manage this in your own lives? Fran, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it is an important question for sure, especially with just how quickly things seem to move on and develop with outside crises that aren't related to the climate movement, but obviously have a huge impact. And one thing for me is just trying to remember that even those small incremental changes, whilst this is a big long-term issue, still contribute to making a difference, and they still move the dial that little bit further, even if it might not seem so at the time. And I think just taking inspiration from the amazing things that are going on, what different campaigns are doing, like Zach mentioned Stop Cambo, for example, and taking inspiration from the people that you work with, the people in your activism circles, and just trying to really kind of hold on to that and hold on to that motivation that they provide. That's one thing that I think helps keep me going. The occasional win in court helps as well, when you see Client Earth has succeeded in litigation. But yeah, there's I think finding inspiration in the good things that are happening and just holding on to them while all the chaos is ongoing.
I like, as you say, the occasional win. I think you probably have more than that, but I chair a charity that does some human rights stuff, and one of my fellow board members said to me, you know, this is human rights law, you know, you're going to win less often than you lose, and that made me feel better about it. So yeah, holding on to those wins when we get them. Zach, has that been your experience of looking to your colleagues and the things that are inspiring to help maintain the motivation?
Yeah, definitely. I think when you get a win, it's hugely energizing. It's always difficult. I think, as you rightly allude to in the question, this area of work is a particularly difficult one in terms of basically we're at a point where we can't, the normal rules of politics, the normal push and pull, you know, incremental change, small wins, for us to get where we need to go, you sort of think, well, those can't apply because we actually we needed massive progress and transformation 30 years ago, and we absolutely need it now. And so it's pretty scary when you're fully signed up and convinced of the change that needs to happen, and then you walk into rooms of people for whom it's one issue among many, rather than the overriding crisis that we should all be orienting ourselves around. And I used to get really het up on things like 1.5 and thinking, oh, well, if we lose 1.5, then we've lost everything. But actually, 1.5 for low-lying coastal communities was never good enough. And what I think has made me feel, what helps me is realizing that every single degree counts, and everything, this fight will never be over until the entire, we talk about being burned out. The planet is burning, but it's not burnt out. There's so much beauty, and there's so many communities that are still able to survive. And as long as those things are true, then I think we have to try and take care of ourselves, but also be aware that there's still a fight on our hands, and we might not be able to secure a livable planet for everyone because of, you know, I feel very angry about decades of inaction, industries which have spread climate misinformation and still are, and they've taken us to a point where a perfect sustainable future seems difficult to imagine, but it's about we can lessen the degrees of harms massively by what we do in this decade, and we're lucky in a way to not be at 2030 or 2050 realizing that not enough was done. There is still time. And so I think that energizes me, but also self-care and taking time out and knowing that even though there's always more to do, it's a long fight. So we need to look after ourselves and not work 7-day weeks. It's hard to actually do that though when you know not enough people are working on these things. But yeah, finding that balance and also letting to use a relevant metaphor, letting the anger and hope be the fuel that keeps you going, I think is important.
Thank you. And Doug, does that chime with you? Have you been both angry and hopeful for a quarter of a century?
Yes. Yes, it's I mean I find the NGO civil society sector is a bit strange. You know, you can have a sort of big win in the morning, and by the evening you've already kind of accepted it and moved on and thinking about the next piece of work, right? So that's
so true.
That's just that's just how it is. And then somebody usually in senior management says, I think we should celebrate this, and then they'll arrange some kind of event in 2 weeks' time, and you've almost forgotten that you won, right? Because you're always on to the next thing. You're always right on to that. What are we going to do now? This is still a problem. So, I mean, it's only when you pause to look back and you see where you've come from, because it always feels like you're banging your head against a brick wall. And so I would say two things about that, which is that firstly, you can draw succor from the value of working with the people that you work with, who are probably also of the same mindset. And you know, that means managing with care, because you can drive each other to destruction. But you know, nonetheless, the process of working with those people is almost invariably an invigorating one. And the second thing I would say is you've got to have your boundaries around your work. So for me, it was, you know, I don't live in London, but I work in London. So most days, pre-pandemic anyway, I would have a commute. I would go from my home and I would go to the office, or I would go to Parliament or down in Westminster. And at the end of the day, I would come back, and that bookmarked the day. And that meant that there were hours that I was working, and this is particularly true, of course, when you have a youngish family. There are hours you were working and there are hours when you were not. And it had to be not just the everyday kind of crisis, but the actual, you know, there had to be something pretty bloody extraordinary to break into that. And it very, very rarely happened. So I think very rarely past that threshold, at which point you say, no, that's not okay. And it is a real thing. I mean, a colleague of mine basically burnt out last summer, had to take nearly a month off with shingles. He left in the late autumn because he couldn't stand it anymore. So, you know, even though he was really good, right? And he didn't have a job to go to, he just needed, like, keep away from me. I can't handle that relationship between the existential ask, the need to do work, the need to do more. So unless you can work this out for yourself personally, then you're going to end up in a bit of trouble. So it's really important to get this right. And it's such a shame that that happened to Sam, because he was great, but, you know, he found that he couldn't establish those boundaries. And in the end, that was destructive for both him and for us, which was a real shame.
Gosh, yeah, that's a telling lesson, isn't it? And of course, this boundary establishing has been much harder since we have email and since the pandemic. I always think it's useful when I speak to an audience of people early in their careers to mention that you know, if you are thinking of having children, like, you can have children and have a professional career. I had a young family in my 20s, and in fact that did help me to have boundaries. You've got 3 kids under 5, like, you just can't answer emails all the time. You've got other stuff to do, and it also makes you really good at delegating and deciding, you know, what you're good at and what you can get other people to do. And so yeah, don't think that you can't have your own life. Like, you need to have this balance, I suppose. And Nick, you knew this and took a year out to consider it all, I suppose.
I did, yeah. I mean, look, I think you can get burnt out working in areas other than those sort of ones that we do. And I struggle to build on the great advice that Fran, Zach, and Doug have given. I mean, without wanting to sound like one of Doug's management team, I do think you need to celebrate the successes, maybe not with the party, but I also recognise right, that's done, move on to the next thing, and you know, also the sense of dread that can sometimes overcome you when you're thinking about some of these huge topics, or maybe it's anger in you know. But I mean, when I first joined, I had many sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how I was going to change the finance system to save the world. And you know, I think you have to break it down into things that you can do, and do them to the best of your ability. But I think maintaining those boundaries where you do try and switch off from it and enjoy the rest of life is pretty critical. And then, you know, I think Doug's point about, you know, the team you work in, I think, is also critical. I mean, I've always found, you know, we have a very close-knit team where I am now. You know, I enjoy spending time with them. I enjoy, you know, being challenged by them, challenging them, and it, you know, but also we look after each other. I was, you know, unfortunate enough to have COVID 18 months ago, and my fellow director of the centres basically threatened to switch off all my communications because I refused to stop working, and she stepped in and basically made an intervention. It's having that sort of support around you, I think, is really helpful, but also it means you're very lucky as well. So it's something probably to be celebrated.
And Nick, have you thought about, you know, when you made this transition, the fact that you could have carried on working at a bank and then done volunteering. Doug referred earlier to that was kind of, you know, that he was doing some voluntary activity before working in the civil society sector. Have you thought about kind of the different bits of your life and how you could try and have your environmental impact in different ways?
Yeah, sorry, yeah, and I think that's a really valid choice for people to think about it, because I think there are many fulfilling, interesting jobs that maybe don't have a direct impact on the environment, and you know, we probably don't want to be taking one that has a negative impact and then trying to offset it effectively. But at the same time, I think that is valid. I personally didn't think about it, but that's partly because the grueling hours that investment banking has as a culture. You know, I was working enough weekends, cancelling most holidays, working long hours all the time. It didn't leave that space for me to be able to look after myself and take on additional things. So it was a sort of survival approach. But I do think in a role where there is more defined boundaries, you know, more of a 9-to-5 culture, I think it's a very valid strategy for people, you know, because it also means that you probably learn things from those outside activities that you can then bring to your role and inform the organization you're working in. So you can, you know, it's not just that you're doing that stuff out there and it doesn't, you know, you have two sides to yourself. It informs you and changes you and means that you're acting differently when you go into your job. And then you become, as you know, I think Fran was referencing earlier, part of that sort of groundswell of pressure from employees within organizations to change, and you'll be more informed and probably better connected to be able to drive some change as a sort of Trojan horse perhaps within some organizations.
Thank you. And I think, Fran, you mentioned to me that when you weren't happy in your work and you hadn't yet found your kind of fulfillment, you did get involved in volunteering stuff and kind of expressed it that way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it made me realize that my job wasn't everything. Like the job wasn't like the definition of me, and there's plenty more that I could be doing outside of the 9-to-5 to be contributing. And it's exactly as Nick just said, like the skills that you can develop in that context can be incredibly valuable to whatever role you end up having, whether it's in the environmental movement or not. And again, it helps with that diversity point, and bringing different things and bringing different skills to the table at whatever organization you do work for. So I would strongly recommend for anyone who doesn't find themselves in a role that they're 100% content with, to look outside and see what they could be doing on an activism point of view, or working with, you know, or a volunteering role, because the small organizations and the grassroots organizations, they need support, they need the skills, and if you can provide that, then yeah, that's great. Yeah,
lovely. Okay, we're getting towards the end, but I wanted to fit in one of these questions before our kind of wrap up question, which is there a time when you've had to tie your kind of green colours to the mast? Have you turned down projects or not applied for jobs, or colleagues you've had to stand up to? Have there been awkward moments? And could you maybe share one with us? Fran, have you got an example like that?
I think it kind of comes with any job, no matter what sector you're in, there's always going to be disagreements, and there's disagreements within the environmental movement itself as to the best solutions to things. In terms of the biggest kind of experience I had in terms of tying my green flag to the mast was just the decision to make the change. It was a big decision, having come from the private sector, and you know, there can be many different benefits to both private and third sector, and there has to be a compromise, like in taking one or the other. But I think or the more kind of like monetary benefits of the private sector, for example, that you don't have to give up, but in some circumstances you have to move on from, you gain in fulfillment. And that's, if anyone's kind of tossing up between the two in that sense as to which direction to go down, that is one thing that I found.
That's lovely thought. Nick, have you, I mean, funnily enough, Nick and I had a not necessarily easy conversation in our professional lives only yesterday about gas as a transition fuel in the context of the war. I think we probably agree. No. Do we agree? No. Yeah. But yeah, you know, it's not like some of these things are not binary. Sometimes you have to say to colleagues or jobs or whatever. Have you got examples of that you'd share with us?
Yeah, I mean, look, I have multiple examples in that probably I can't name names, but we're constantly being approached by companies wanting to work with us because and some of them because they want to genuinely change and they want to understand what they need to do that, and some because it'll provide reflected glory, and if we don't get those decisions right, then we are in danger of greenwashing. So you know, we're constantly making these decisions. For example, we were approached by one of the largest asset managers in the world, someone who is now making quite a lot of noise about sustainability and quite high profile things, but we didn't feel that they were delivering the scale of change that they could, or even that they were serious about it. You know, so we turned down working with them. And as you say rightly, Belinda, you know, these are really nuanced questions, some of them. So the discussion we had about gas as a transition fuel was partly about whether new gas ought to be people should be investing in new gas infrastructure. You know, and when you start to think about questions beyond climate, but also in terms of social resilience and poverty, and the broader environmental beyond thing, it gets even more nuanced. And therefore, yes, we have robust conversations with, you know, between ourselves and as Fran said, even within others within the so-called green movement about what is good enough and what is right. But I think the nice thing about it, at least, I think, is most people agree what the right endpoint is. They may just disagree about what is needed to get there. But you know that you're having those disagreements from a constructive place rather than from you know, fundamentally different worldviews, as it were.
Thank you. Zach, I guess, you know, tying colours to the mast is kind of your thing. Have you got any kind of final kind of couple of thoughts about that, or advice for our students?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, in my role, it's very easy to look quite audacious and probably like an annoying little twerp sometimes, because you're telling an 800-year-old institution and colleges which are incredibly eminent institutions that you don't think that what they're doing is good enough, essentially. Me, as a just fresh out of an undergraduate degree, it probably comes across sometimes as a bit annoying. But I mean, when I came into this role, I was horrified at the fact that our university is still accepting millions of pounds each year from fossil fuel companies in research funding, for example. And horrified, furious, upset, betrayed, angry, whatever adjective you want to throw at it. And I have had to have incredibly difficult conversations pushing the university to engage with that greenwashing conversation. And I'm really pleased that in this event we're talking about greenwashing, because in a university like Cambridge, we are ripe for the picking for a company who wants to associate itself with an eminent science-led institution with a commitment to tackling the climate crisis. Because you know, if Shell works with Cambridge, it does make you hesitate to designate them a climate villain, because surely Cambridge wouldn't work with a company that was so egregious. So I've really had to push on that, and I think you have to try and hold in your mind, I don't want to sound like too much of a kind of white liberal about this, but you have to hold in your mind the people who aren't in the room. You know, when we have conversations about Shell, the families of the people in the Ogoni land and the Niger Delta who've died and whose land has been completely degraded because of the activities of Shell, they're not in that room. They're never going to be, they're never invited. But when you take a stand and ask difficult questions and hold up meetings and confront an institution on things which are difficult but which are critically important, you are standing in solidarity with those affected communities. And that, I think, we should all try and do more. So I guess as my final piece of advice around, if you do decide to go through a more corporate or larger institutional route, and you know, I suppose Cambridge is an example of a huge institution, So what I try and do is remember that what solidarity means is giving something up, and that can mean giving up the enjoyment of a nice, peaceful committee meeting, but actually having a really difficult time and pushing really hard. And that is how we show that we care and that we're pushing as hard as we can. So if you go into one of those spaces, transform that space, don't be transformed by that space, is, I guess, my last.
Thank you, Zach. That's a fantastic last contribution. Doug, have you got a final contribution you'd like to make of some sort?
Not a huge amount, because I think there's an immense amount of richness from what we've already heard. All I would say is that, you know, how green do you end up? How far do you pin your green colours to the mast? I mean, as I said, I've been immensely lucky to work in an organisation that is trying to drive that agenda. Whether we get it right all the time is another question. But, you know, we're always trying to push the level of radicalism of government and industry where we can. But even in that forum, you know, you've always got these questions of how high do you pitch your ask? You know, how fast do we want to phase out of single-use plastic? You know, what's the date that we put on it? What date do we want UK biodiversity to have recovered by? And you know, there are, even in this, you know, we like to style ourselves as a radical green organisation, but you know, even there you've got challenges about how, you know, how fundamentalist versus how pragmatic that you want to get in terms of trying to drive change. And ultimately, you know, the decision ends up coming to be, well, how fast do you drive change? What are your theories of change? By being, you know, more out there, or do you be more to go with what is still for most people would still be an intensely radical call, but, you know, feels like it's closer to what might be achievable. So I think wherever you go, there are always going to be those kind of judgments and challenges where it's going to be a bit tricky, and the path of what is the right call is never going to be straightforward. But that doesn't mean that in almost any job you can go into, well, except junior levels of a big oil corporation probably, it doesn't mean that you know, in most places you can't make some kind of a difference wherever you land up.
That's lovely, Doug. Thank you. And I'd like to thank Zach in particular for bringing in the voices of the people who aren't in this room, which is often inherent when we're talking about these issues, but thank you for doing so explicitly, Zach. So we're going to wrap up now. Somebody's asked in the chat whether or not they can reach out to the panelists on LinkedIn. Try it. You might be lucky. I haven't asked the panelists involved, so I can't say, but you can definitely reach out to them and see how you get along. So otherwise, thank you all very much for your time, and the best of luck as you kind of forge these journeys over the weeks and months and years ahead.